Electrocast.
Hi, and welcome to Deep Leadership. I'm your host, John Rennie. Well, I hope all is well with you today. It is Saturday morning, and I'm drinking a hot cup of Bottom Gun coffee from my friends at bottomguncoffee.com. I have another great show lined up for you, but before I get started, I just wanted to mention my latest leadership book. It's called You Have the Watch, and it's available on my website and on Amazon. In fact, it's the #1 new release and a bestseller on Amazon. I'm really excited about this book because it's not actually a book. It's a guided journal for leaders that will take you through an entire year of leadership training. There are 50 themes in the book, and each day you'll reflect on a different facet of that theme. This journal is designed to be on your desk at work for you to read and reflect on for about 15 minutes each morning. Leadership skills are like any other skills. You need to practice them to get better at them, and this journal helps you practice those skills. Now, if you're interested in this guided journal, go to youhavethewatch.com or Amazon and pick up your copy today. Now, if you're looking for other ways to support what I do on this show, purchase any one of my books at johnsrennie.com, and podcast listeners can use the discount code DEEP at checkout to get additional savings. Also, I just wanted to mention that the Deep Leadership Podcast is now ranked in the top 2.5% most popular shows out of 3 million podcasts globally, according to ListenScore. And I wanted to thank each and every one of you for listening in each week and sharing these episodes with your friends. You have helped this podcast grow into a top-performing show, and I really appreciate it, so thank you. Well, that is it. Today we're going to be talking about the role of humility in leadership, and humility is an often confused subject, so I'm excited to talk about it some more. My guest today is Dr. Matthew Sowcik. He is the author of a new book called The H Factor, the intersection between humility and great leadership. Now, how can humility lead to great leadership? Matthew will help us understand this connection. So, are you ready to dive in? Let's get started.
Welcome to Deep Leadership. Leadership is a people business. That's the philosophy of your podcast host, John Rennie. As a former Cold War submarine officer who spent 20 plus years leading businesses in corporate America before starting his own manufacturing business, he knows that leadership matters. Are you ready for some real-world actionable advice from John as well as his expert guests?
I'm ready.
The show starts right now.
Welcome to the Deep Leadership Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Matthew Sowcik. Matthew has been teaching for over 20 years and is currently a professor of leadership development at University of Florida. His research focuses on humility and the creation of organizational leadership programs. He teaches both undergraduate and graduate level courses concentrated on interpersonal leadership development, organizational leadership, and advanced leadership theory. He is the author of a brand new book called The H Factor, the intersection between humility and great leadership. And I am excited to have him on the show to talk about the subject of humility, which is very important to me. And I'm so glad you're here, Matthew. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I know you have tons of knowledge about leadership, so I can't wait to ask you some questions and look forward to any questions you have about humility.
Yeah, this is going to be fun, and I'm excited about this topic, especially. But I wanted to get started. I'd like to know a little bit about yourself. Like, how did you end up finding yourself in higher education and then in researching and teaching on the subject of leadership?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like most people, it was a lot of right turns and left turns and kind of figuring things out along the way. Certainly a lot of failure, but just kind of keeping going and moving forward. When I was younger, my father was a clinical psychologist, so I was really passionate about this idea of human behavior. I really wanted to know people, loved watching people go to the beach and sit on a bench and just kind of watch people. And I just found so much pleasure, so much joy in kind of trying to understand people better. I knew that his path wasn't the path I was going to take, so I had to find how would I apply human behavior, the practice and the study of human behavior. And an advisor of mine in college suggested this idea of organizational psychology. And I just fell in love with it. And so I started studying it, and that led me to Wilkes University for my undergraduate. And then Columbia has a wonderful master's program where I learned a ton about leadership theory, and then went out to Gonzaga University to learn more about the kind of practical application of leadership, how you could go out and coach it, how you could build organizational leadership programs. At that point, I really felt like if I can know as much as possible about this topic, somebody would hire me for that. And they did. They did. Wilkes University gave me my first teaching job. I fell in love with teaching. It really is my passion, is being in front of a classroom, engaging with students. And then a couple of years ago, about 6 years ago, University of Florida recruited me to come down here, and we were going to be 2 hours from the beach in both directions. So it was really hard to say no.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, that's interesting. So you really went down this path fairly early and kind of stayed on this path as far as, leadership and organizational psychology. And when did you find you had interest in the subject of humility? When did humility sort of come out as, wow, this is this special thing that the great leaders have it? And where did you become aware that this is something that you wanted to dive deeper in?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I haven't been asked that question before. So the idea of leadership happened really, really early in my career. What I was going to study, what I was going to teach, and ultimately what I would research in leadership has changed significantly over time. So in the beginning, I realized that I felt pretty hollow as a teacher, not having had experience working with leaders. So I built a consulting company. I went out and got jobs that would allow me to manage and lead while I was teaching. And those became really important for me to understand when I was talking about theory or when I was talking about practice in the classroom, how much of it actually worked and how much of it was really good theory, kind of in that idealized world. So that was really important for me to be able to talk to MBA students or talk to emerging leaders in that process. So I spent a lot of time in my early years doing that, really perfecting this kind of craft around coaching and leadership development and building out leadership programs and really trying to understand what worked. About 15 years ago, I started considering what's going to happen in that kind of second half of my academic career. And I read the book Good to Great, and I really loved it. And I know that's the book that you have a tremendous amount of passion for. It just really resonated with me. And it was amazing. Every single time I would go to a manager to talk about being in the leadership program that I was creating, or every time I talked to a CEO, it would be right there on the shelf. Good to Great would be right there on the shelf. Big, bright red cover. And I try to build a bond by saying, oh my gosh, what did you think of the book? And they would always say, I'm going to get to that. Or, I got that as part of another leadership training. I just haven't had a chance to read it yet. And it occurred to me that what Collins had done is he had sold 4 million books that people had recommended that a lot of people didn't read because if they had read it, it says really specifically there, humility is critical for level 5 leaders. And so that really my passion around why did people not kind of hold on to humility as a leadership, characteristic, and what would we need to do to really kind of amplify Jim Collins' message? And that's a lot of what I think my book is about.
Excellent. That's so good. And it's funny because I remember reading Good to Great and it was a great book, but what I keyed in on was this idea of a level 5 leader and the humility and fierce resolve, this yin and yang, like pulling, and I was like, wait, that's an acceptable leadership trait. It was almost like because that was naturally my natural leadership trait, and so I didn't know that was acceptable. I'd always told, as the Jack Welch top down, you're on fire, you have this high ego, I was never that leader. So I thought, well, I must be wrong. But then Jim Collins told me, no, you're actually right. This is actually a better way to go. And so it gave me permission to lead the way I wanted to lead. So I remember that book really changing how I thought about leadership.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think Jack Welch is a really good example because Jack Welch is one of those guys who's high profile, came in, did this amazing stuff in a really short period of time. But unfortunately, and Jim Collins would suggest this, Jack Welch then left it off to the next leader who had trouble doing what Jack Welch did. And then the next leader significantly had trouble. Yeah. And when we talk about leadership, we often only talk about leaders in terms of short amount of of time? What did they do during their time?
Right.
And that charisma, and even to some degree, that narcissism of believing that leadership is only 3 years or 10 years and defined by what that person did, is short-sighted to companies building long-term success, or countries building long-term success, or sports teams building long-term success, where a leader builds a culture built on humility that the next coach takes over, the next politician takes over, whatever it may be, so that that can continue to build with strength and resolve. Yeah, I absolutely think that we often think of those really big, flashy names, and that's where we get into some trouble when we talk about leadership and what really works. It's hard to be a Steve Jobs because, one, you're probably not as creative or as much of a genius, but also you're probably not as much of a narcissist as Steve Jobs was in that process. So if we put him out as the ideal leader that everyone should try to emulate, we really run into some issues on emerging leaders, middle managements, and certainly on the senior levels when people don't have those characteristics. And even Steve himself failed, got kicked out of his company the first time. And he himself said that it was humility from being kicked out, from finding his biological mother, that really helped him the second time around become what Apple was. And he was able to take much more feedback, let people run who were doing their jobs. And even in that case, humility really helped him kind of temper his narcissism in that process.
Yeah, I believe that's exactly right. Yep. So, sometimes when people think of humility, they think of weakness. How would you define humility as it relates to leadership? And I know you define it in the book, but how would you say, like, for the listeners who are listening in, what is humility as it relates to leadership?
I really appreciated some of your vulnerability around this idea of, could humility be a leadership characteristic? And then hearing from Collins, because that's exactly where I started out, was my definition around humility was kind of being subservient and not caring about yourself. And some of the roots of the definition go back to being lower than the ground and some of those pieces. What I try to do in the book is I try to talk about how humility has been kind of redefined over the last 3 decades. And when we're talking about humility now in research, we really talk about having a proper perspective of ourselves, a proper perspective of others, and a proper perspective of something bigger out there. And what I mean by proper perspective, you can never really have an accurate perception of yourself. You can take in certain feedback that changes in time, but you can have more or less a proper perspective of who you are compared to others. When we talk about the proper perspective of others, it's how do I see the role others play in my life? And then how do I see the role I play in others' life? Do I have a proper perspective around that? And then do I have a proper perspective that I'm connected to something bigger? And a lot of times that may be spirituality, but it also can be purpose, culture, organizations where they get people to really understand themselves, understand their connection to their teammates, and then understand that bigger purpose that the organization has becomes tremendously important in building momentum for that organization to move forward.
Okay. So it's more than just being humble. It's more about your relationships with others and in the organization and the company itself.
Yeah, and I think it's more about what the perspective you have. So if you think about the times in which humility is most often used, someone wins an award and they get up on stage and say, "I'm really humbled." Yeah. That amazing moment puts into perspective, oh my gosh, I won this great award with great people out there. So I have a proper perspective that I am one of many people. I think there's this proper perspective, let's say humility on the other direction, when you are an alcoholic and you find yourself, at your lowest point, and you go to AA and they say the first step is to really humble yourself and say you can't get over it. That's a proper perspective. Like, I can't do this on my own. I need other people. So what humility ends up being is just this proper perspective. I can read who I am right now in my life. I can read who other people are and their importance to me, or their maybe even lack of importance to me. And then I can understand what's the perspective I have of how I'm connected to something much bigger. So and that becomes the humility piece.
So it's more about perspective. It's more about where you are, I got you. Okay, that's That's a great way to think about it. I haven't really considered it that way. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
So
I appreciate
let's
that.
talk about the new book. I mean, I'm excited. It's
Yeah,
called
thank
The
you.
H Factor: The Intersection Between Humility and Great Leadership. So the H Factor, I assume that's humility.
You got it.
And we talked a little bit about this, but Jim Collins' work on level 5 leadership was some of the beginning, or something that helped get the ball rolling. But why did you write this book, and really, who is it for?
Yeah, and you know, kind of the story of how this got started and where I came up with the H Factor was I was sitting watching some TV with my stepdaughter, and we were watching the X Factor, and there was kind of an exchange between a singer that was up there, and he sang beautifully. He sang this Spanish song. It was gorgeous. But as soon as he was done singing, he stepped up to the judge. I think it was Demi Lovato at that time. And he said to her, "All right, woman, what'd you think?" And she's taken back and she can't believe it. And she said, "What I think is that humility is sexier than any song that you just sang." And then another judge spoke up and said, "You know, humility is really sexy. It's something that you really need to learn." And they kind of really go and roll with this. And as I'm sitting there watching with my daughter, I'm like, this guy is a jerk. Like, I thought he was a beautiful singer, but he's a jerk, and he's just condescending every single second. And then all of a sudden, every judge votes, and they all give 4 yeses. And it kind of threw me back to think, do we do this all the time? Is technical skill all that matters? And are we sacrificing everything in our organizations, everything in our communities, because all we want is the smartest, or all we want is the most technically apt person? And the thing that bothered me the most is it didn't even bother my daughter. She just kept watching and she was waiting for the next person. And I thought, there's a whole generation of, emergent leaders growing up believing that humility is not a real key term to leadership. And if we're gonna deal with 9.6 billion people by the year 2050, we better have some humility to do that, to work together, to engage with that. That led me to, once again, kind of rereading Jim Collins' book. And it's amazing. Kind of in the middle of the book, he suggests that the X factor, and I quote him, "The X factor of leadership is not personality, it's humility." And I thought, like, wow, what a cool coincidence. So I started calling it the X factor, kind of based on his quote, based on this TV show. And I think that's why humility became really important. But I think when you get down to why humility, it's this idea that, like, great companies are practicing it at this point. Google and Zappos all have it built into their culture. I had the chance in the book to talk with the vice president of human resources at Google, and he completely shifted the culture in the early 2000s because he found that it's 10 times harder to get into Google than it is Harvard. He was getting smart people, but those smart people weren't working together because they were arrogant. So he started hiring for humility at that point in time. The more I read, the more I found research that suggested humility is connected to pro-social qualities like generosity and diversity, creativity, emotional intelligence, teamwork, systems thinking. It kind of list goes on. If you think about the world's religion, like the one central piece that most every single world religion has, it's humility. Then I started reading thought leaders and people like Adam Grant and Zig Ziglar and Daniel Goleman, all Adam Bryant, like Seth Godin, all of these folks at some point or another talk about humility as being important. And then there's been books and books written about people like, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, James Madison, Ben Franklin having this central piece. I kind of thought, like, if Google and Moses and Ben Franklin all are supporting this, is there another characteristic out there that everyone supports? And it just makes sense as we start to look through not only the research as academics like me do, but just popular press and thought leaders who are great and people who've done outstanding stuff. And that's why leadership and humility for me was really kind of this important soapbox to stand on.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Leadership skills are like any other skills. You need to practice them to get better at them. Best-selling leadership author John S. Rennie knows this. That's why he's written a new book called You Have the Watch. It's a guided journal for leaders designed to take you through an entire year of leadership training. By the end of the year, you will master 50 of the most important leadership skills. If you want to have a greater impact on the results and people in your organization, go to youhavethewatch.com and pick up your copy today.
This episode is brought to you by the Fraternity of Excellence. The Fraternity of Excellence is an online and real-world community for men who are looking to improve in all areas of their lives. The men of FOE are working together to become better husbands, fathers, and leaders at work and in their communities. They live by a simple philosophy: as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Now, I've been a member for more than 3 years, and for me, I finally found a brotherhood of men that I was missing from my time in the military. Now, I love being around guys who are dedicated to becoming a better version of themselves. So if you're interested in becoming a man of excellence as well, go to fraternityofexcellence.com, or you can reach out directly to me to learn more. Yeah, and it's interesting too, and why, and just your thoughts on why it's not a more important, why it doesn't play a more important role in leadership development. We tend to, like you say, we don't like the jerks, the bosses who are jerks, but then they still get promoted, they still get moved up, and they, if they get the results, then we move them up. If they have the technical skills, we move them up. So why do you think we're missing it when it comes to leadership development? What can be done differently about that?
I think that may have been the question I was searching for more than anything else, because sure, I can write a book on humility and the importance of humility, but if you look up and only see leaders who aren't humble, then What good is this book anyway? Maybe I write a book on how to be a jerk, and then that's the successful one in that process. But as I started to think about it, I thought there was a way that we could start to address some of this, talk about this, and really get people to a place where maybe we even change it. So, first is the culture of America, where most of the academic leadership research, most of the books come out of it. It's this Western perspective around individualism, the individualness of leaders, this idea of you don't need anyone, you can make it on your own. And fundamentally, it's just not true. As a leader, you can't make it on your own. I mean, the whole process of leadership is needing others. So this more collective process becomes something that is really important to be part of our culture. I think as we get more divided, we see more of that individualistic, I'm right, you're wrong process. And we need to get back to a place of humility where we collectively understand that we're the United States, or we're this Western culture, and we need to start to build bridges across. I think the second piece that's really influenced this to some degree is this, leadership selfie nature to some degree. And when I talk about the selfie, I talk about social media. When you go on social media, I even fall into this habit of seeing a father who's also writing a book, who's also an academic professor, and he's on these, and he's doing this. And I'm like, oh my God, how is he pulling this off? Because I am a shambles right now. How is he doing this? And what I don't know is that he took 500 pictures to just get that one picture, and we always see this in social media. We see the idealized, the perfect, and that just is not the truth. We are imperfect, we are impermanent, and we are incomplete. And that's just the facts of it. But we have this nature to believe that only the perfect is good. So everybody's putting out the perfect, and it gets away from the idea that humility or vulnerability are things that we really need to be talking about, embracing, and using. Because you'll say this, and I'll say this, my life is a bunch of failures that detoured me to my success right at this point. And if I didn't have those, if I didn't learn from those, if I didn't grow from those, I certainly wouldn't be here talking with you today in this process. And I can't wait to that next failure that helps me kind of move up and understand and engage with that process. So I think that's the second piece. And the final piece is, I think, the way that we evaluate leaders. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I think we get into a place where we want success now. So the University of Florida just hired a football coach. He hasn't even played a game, and they're already calling for his, oh my God, is he going to win enough? Are we going to win the championship?
Yeah.
He hasn't even laid a culture yet, and they're already giving him 1 year to do it. And it's just, it's impossible, the expectations we have on people now. There's no room for humility in that culture of learning, growing, building something. It's true with politicians when they have 2 or 4 years, they have to think about just now. So they make decisions that are short-sighted. They make decisions that are just about them. They don't build out something. It happens in sports, politics, but it really happens in business. I mean, the tenure for a CEO, I read the other day, was like 5 years. How could you ever build something in that short amount of time that's sustainable, engages, prospers in that process? I mean, by the 3rd year, you're just learning the job in that. So there's a lot of humility in this idea of how we train and evaluate people. MBA programs don't talk about it. Leadership development programs don't talk about it. Organizational leadership programs, no one's talking about this humility piece. And if anything were to come out of the book, that's what I hope, is that we have now a platform like emotional intelligence did in the 90s. Let's start talking about humility as being kind of that critical cornerstone to start our development. And once we start from there, we can, read Simon Sinek's Start With Why or Rethink from Adam Grant. We can read all those other books. We can build off those once we understand that humility is a really important place to go.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I remember I got my first manufacturing plant at 32 years old, and I remember thinking, well, I've got the corner office, I've got this, this manufacturing plant with like 140 employees, fairly small, but I thought, well, I've got to have all the answers. I'm the boss, and I have to, they're going to rely on me. I need to have all the answers. I need to be that stoic leader in the corner office, telling people, you do this, you do this. And and I think the big mistake I made was trying to have all the answers. What I learned in that first big management role was that what I learned is that the collective wisdom of the team was so much more than my own personal ideas on how to run things. And so when I engaged people and got this wisdom, the people that have been doing the job for years and years, and got their opinion, their ideas, and brought them all together, we made much better decisions, and we grew faster, and we became more profitable. But it was the idea of like, it's not about me, it's about the people. And that's what consultants do, right? They ask all the experienced people, where do we need to work on? And what I learned is, like, I have to almost be an internal consultant. I have to go talk to the people that are actually doing the work, and find out how we can make it better. And once I did that, and this is a matter of, it's a little bit of a humility. So it's like, okay, well, it's not just about me, and I don't have to have all the answers, but if I can tap into where all the answers are, we're going to be so much better than if I try to do it all by myself. So it's this idea of the collective versus the individual. When you make that decision and you do that, you realize, wow, there's this wealth of knowledge out there that most leaders never tap into.
John, if people get anything out of this podcast today, and I'm ashamed to say this, they should listen to what you just said. Like, that's the fundamental piece of humility, is this idea that it's ridiculous. We wouldn't do it in any other world, but as soon as we become a leader, we believe we have some kind of divine wisdom to answer all questions. And it happens to you, it happens to me. Like, I better know the answers to this now because I'm the leader. When you weren't any smarter that day you woke up, you're just as smart, or maybe a little bit smarter than the day before, but you don't have all the answers. And it's backed up by all the research. All the research out there suggests that a leader who is humble enough to say, I don't know. No, you don't want to say, I don't know all the time. You want to have some knowledge about your job. But if you have a real difficult issue and you say, I don't know, and you bring it to your group, it is suggested that your followers will feel so much more empowered that they will give you blood, sweat, and tears to figure out that answer and work with you to get that answer than you just kind of commanding it from above. But we love those stories where a leader commanded something from above and it worked, and it's the way we should do it. But it's just fundamentally our problems are so much more difficult. There's so many more people. We're trying to do things so much faster now. You have to have what they call collective humility in that process. So when enough people have humility, it all comes together to be able to say, let's hear from everyone. Let's hear divergent points. Let's be creative. How do we get to these places where we're able to really answer this question with everybody's wisdom in that process? And I'm so happy you found that, because as a consultant or coach, that's always been kind of the genius behind that, is you just go in and you ask, you bring people together, ask them what they think, and then you are able to get to that solution. And I always wondered about leaders who brought in consultants when they could like yourself be that kind of internal consultant to go find those answers and engage people in that way.
Yeah, I think, I think it takes a little bit of humility to say, okay, well, I don't really know, but in fact, I even say a lot in my books too, is that you don't have to have all the answers as a leader, but you have to have all the right questions. You have to have the right questions, and be willing to listen to the answers to those questions. And once I learned that, leadership got easier for me. I'm like, okay, I don't have to have all the answers. I just need to know what kind of questions to ask, who to ask them, when to listen, how to bring the ideas together, how to try to formulate a plan based on the best ideas of my team, and leadership became easier after that. I found the pressure was off, right? It was like, okay, well, I'm like a conductor here in an orchestra. I've got to get the best performance out of the whole group, but I don't have to play the instrument. I'm not playing any instrument.
And maybe the best example that people will kind of recognize or remember is that, and I talk a little bit about in the book, is that show, The Undercover Boss. And I always find this Undercover Boss show like the most amazingly ridiculous show in the world. You get the CEO who's so out of touch that people don't recognize him. You put him in all this makeup, you send him down, and what they do is they ask questions, right? They start saying to the people, and it's not even just questions about the job, like what is the job you do? They get to see how hard the person works. They get a proper perspective of what that other person is to the organization. But then they start asking questions about their life. And you find that they're completely transformed. Like, oh my gosh, you have a family? Oh my gosh, you're struggling? I'm going to help you with this. I'm going to help you with that. Oh, policy should be different in the organization. And it's always amazing because at the end, they always talk like, oh, I'm humbled now to this idea that these people really matter. They're the heart of the business. They have answers to what we should be doing, and we do have to take care of them. And I think that's a really important point, is that like proper perspective of others becomes really important to be able to get to that place of a whole culture and organization moving forward in the same direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely. I really see that. It's actually, I talk about it in the book, All in the Same Boat. But we had developed a process called Fridays on the Floor, where all of the management team and eventually all salary employees would go work on the shop floor first Friday of every month for the morning. And what it was basically, Undercover Boss before Undercover Boss was even a show. So we were actually working on the shop floor with people. We built relationships with the people, but we also listened to it and observed, and like the tooling that was improper, procedures that weren't right, equipment that was not maintained. And we learned all the stuff about what was really happening. But a lot of management teams, they're kind of sequestered in their offices or their conference rooms or their conference calls, and they don't get out to where the real value is added. So that's the beauty of Undercover Boss. You actually see when you do get out to where the value is added, where the people who are actually adding value, that's where all the answers are. That's where all the wisdom is, but you've got to get out and go to where the real value is made. And I think many managers miss that. They sort of think, well, I've got to make all the decisions from the corner office. And that's just a big mistake, I think.
You're absolutely right. It's probably the simplest thing that we do wrong in organizations is we silo ourselves and we say we have to fight for our own resources. We have to fight against the rest of the organization. And there's no humility in that. There's just no humility. If you have some humility and say, okay, sales is collectively contributing to accounting, which is collectively contributing to marketing. How do we work together? How do I know what you do and what I do and how they're equally important to work towards? Use this phrase in the book. If you're really a good leader, you're never the end. And sometimes I think when I meet CEOs or when I meet emerging leaders who are great, they believe that if I just make this leadership position, or once I get into the CEO position, I'm the end. Like people answer to me. And the truth is, when you're a leader, you're not the end. You're just a means towards the organizational's end, or the other people who work for you, their end. And that's the humility shift we need. So how do you collectively go out and find out what are those ends and how are you helping people reach those?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah, one of the challenges I see with this book and with even my work sometimes is that the people who really need to read this book are most likely the ones that are not going to read it. In other words, the people that have humility and realize that there's a lot for me to learn, they're going to be picking up books. They're going to be trying to make themselves better. But it's often the bosses that don't have humility or don't have any self-awareness that are less likely to pick up a book. How I don't know what your thoughts on it, but how do we encourage people to dive into books like this and learn more about humility when they're likely they don't have that? I don't know the answer to this, but it's something I've thought about this a lot as I've been writing books.
Yeah, John, I love that question. It's something that I haven't talked much about on any podcast or in any stuff that I've written, but I've thought a lot about it. It's this idea that, hundreds of people when I was writing this book would really encourage me. They were really supportive, much like yourself. Like it's a great topic. We need stuff on it. And people would even say to me, my gosh, my boss absolutely needs this. Or my wife absolutely, don't tell her I said this, but my wife really needs this. Or my best friend really needs this. Not a single time did anyone come up to me and say, I really need this. We don't see it in ourselves, but we see it in other places. And what I tell people, and one way that's been really kind of useful for me to help people get this into the hands of those who really need it, I would make the argument that we all need more humility, and we all need to understand a proper perspective of ourselves, others, and this larger thing. So everyone's going to benefit from reading it. But if you have someone in particular who you think could really benefit from humility, what works really well, even in the short period of time that I've seen people buy the book, they'll hold it up and they'll take a picture of themselves on social media, which is such an amazing platform. And what they'll do is say, oh my gosh, I'm reading this book. I've really liked X, Y, and Z. I'm going to recommend these 3 people read it. And usually you pick 2 people who are pretty humble and you pick another person who isn't humble. It's almost that it's that ice bucket challenge sort of effect.
Yes.
And what I found is that people who are grouped with people who are humble believe that they're also humble, and they will say, oh my gosh, I'm definitely reading it. And then you can go in and call them out. You can call them out. Oh, did you read the book? Can we talk a little bit about this book I found on page 5? And it really has kind of taken off that way in this process of people almost disguising their interest in particular people reading it. And I've seen some real success around that. But I think the best way to get somebody to read a book is when you recommend it. And you can't recommend a book you didn't read. It's almost like saying, okay, here, you need humility, I don't. But if you say, gosh, I've read this book, I got a lot out of it, I think you would love it. It's not saying you need it. It's saying, I really liked this book. It was interesting. You are an interesting person. You'd really like it. And I think when we get away from some of our preconceived notions that humility is a really bad thing, is a thing that we don't want to not have, so recommending this, then we get into a place where people feel really comfortable talking about and engaging with it. There's a lot of questions in the book, and I found from a mentor-mentee relationship, each of the chapters has questions at the end. And it's a really great way to if your mentor's needing humility, it's a great way to say, hey, what do you think about, question number 3 here? If your mentee needs it, boy, I'm struggling around 3. What do you think? And giving some opportunity to just have a conversation.
I love it. That's great advice. Listeners, if you're listening in, you got a boss that might need this. It's great. Matthew's given us some great tips there to how to get that book in their hands. So that's fantastic. So Matthew, how can people find out more about you and this new book?
Yeah, and I guess that's the final recommendation is if that doesn't work, just email me and I'll send them a free copy and I'll say, boy, you're such an amazing leader. I'd really love for you to read the book, and we'll get it into his hands that way. That's not a problem at all. My email address for the University of Florida is just my last name at ufl.edu, but I'm on Instagram, my name Matthew Sowcik, and Facebook, certainly Twitter and all those other social media platforms. And the book itself is this red covered book, The H Factor. You can find it on Amazon. Just search my last name and it will be there. And I hope you read it. I hope you enjoy it. Don't hesitate to write me an email and let me know what you think, because I think you will know this, John. Sometimes writing these books is a real lonely process up until the moment you give it out. And then you love to hear the feedback. You love to hear all the good things you got out of it. And also all the I disagree with this particular point. And that helps evolve your thinking with stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you chose a red cover, by the way.
So I had to. I paid homage. I paid homage to to the original. Yes, it's actually the same shade. I had to find out what color was, and so it was
I love that.
done.
I love that
Yeah.
you've done that. So for us leadership geeks out there, that was good that you did that. Absolutely.
Thank you
I love
so much.
that.
I appreciate you saying that.
Well, okay, so everybody, the book is The H Factor, the intersection between humility and great leadership. It's brand new. It's just out, and I highly recommend it for everyone listening in. So we'll put the links in the show notes for everybody so you can get out there and find it. You can find it on Amazon as Matthew pointed out, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Matthew, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing this new book and sharing all your thoughts on humility. I think it's a very important topic, and I learned a lot today.
Yeah, we could talk for hours around this. I so appreciate your thoughts around this, and thank you for having me on your show. I really, really do appreciate it.
Oh, I loved it. So thanks again. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.
Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all you do.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information and updates, please visit our website at www.deepleadershippodcast.com or johnsrennie.com. Until next time, take care.
If you're a working professional wondering what's next for your career, you've come to the right place. Whether you're looking for a promotion, growth, or a potential career transition, look no further. With over 30 years working in a variety of industries, I share my insider knowledge with those ready to get ahead on Career Advancement with Craig Ansell. Tune in to get your strategies for success.
Hey, it's Tim from 50 Years of Music with 50-Year-Old White Guys, the comedy podcast you had no idea you needed. Join Ben, Jeff, and me as we continue our musical road trip back through the years and around the globe. See, just when you thought all white guys were like Joe Rogan, you come across 3 educators trying to remember when we were cool.
50 Years of Music with 50-Year-Old White Guys.
Electricast.